Beg your pardon? Meredith, who is this coarse person with the foreign accent?
Hello, I'm Danny, and this is Sylvia.
Yo.
Apparently, in the beginning of these things, I meant to say follow, subscribe, share, do the internet buttons, all the stuff. I'm not doing that enough, they say. So follow, subscribe. Oh yeah, I mean, the name of the show would probably help, right?
Yeah, what shall we subscribe? In the beginning, there was.
This is the Talking Ass.
There you are.
Follow,
Boo.
okay? And enjoy the show. Hey, all right, let's start. We're honored to welcome the host of the fantastic Vietnam War podcast, Green Hell, Stephen Comstock. Welcome.
Thank you, Danny. It's good to be here. It's an honor.
I've been listening, man. It's impressive. All alone, you push through these like stories. You bring in a little bit of yourself into it, but mainly it's pretty academic and interesting. And you've gone 20 episodes, and we have not yet even arrived at what most people would call the Vietnam War, which is the American part of the war. So you're setting us up. How would I say? It's a pretty extensive setup, and I think most people need it. You know, it's been interesting.
It's a long road. And when I started, I was surprised myself to learn the backdrop to the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, what Americans consider the Vietnam War. And I was fascinated by how much it doesn't get any coverage. It doesn't get any press. And it's some of the craziest stuff I've ever read about in terms of war history, war knowledge, the battles, the geopolitics of the post World War II era. But I will admit that I'm, to your listeners, they should know I'm just a guy. I'm just a guy who, had always been fascinated with the war in Vietnam. And I was listening to a podcast called Over the Top, a great war podcast by a gentleman named Richard Cantu. And he was talking about World War I. And so I cruised through all his episodes. He's got like 70 out. And I was like, dang, man, if he's doing it to preserve the history of World War I should be doing something similar to preserve the history of the Vietnam War. So I'm trying to take my listeners through a chronological story. And it's a long story. I mean, the Vietnam War is really a 30-year epic tragedy. But most Americans only know about maybe the mid 60s through the early to mid 70s when our involvement was, maybe about 10 years. But that's only a third of the total story. So,
yeah. And it's a story of tragedies and repeated mistakes and all kinds of themes come into this. How did you get into it? So you're a ranger by background, right?
I am.
Still active, or what's the status?
No. I did a relatively short stint as an Army Ranger in the United States Army, 75th Ranger Regiment. I joined in 2012, 19 years old, right out of high school. Did 4.5 years, got out in 2017, and went to college on the GI Bill. The United States offers, free college, paid for college, rather. It's not really free. You pay for it in a lot of different other ways, but went to college here in Colorado, where I currently live. So I got a degree here in cybersecurity, and now I work for the United States Space Force. I can promise it's nothing glamorous. It's nothing cool. It's necessary, but it's mind-numbing. It's nothing like what the movies want you to think.
It's gonna be cool when you get to say that to your kids, that you work for the Space Force. I mean, I can't imagine anything cooler than that.
Luckily for me, the power of imagination fills in a lot of the unsavory and boring parts of the Space Force.
Did you like that TV show, another Netflix show, Space Force?
Space Force, yes. I can say that show was well done, and specifically, there's one scene where Steve Carell and his minions, I forget who all. I think it was towards the end of the last season. They're about to do something. They're about to hit the execute on a command to, launch a cyber strike against the Russians or Chinese satellite. And right when they're about to do it, they get the blue screen of death because Microsoft pushes an update right then and there. And whoever whoever wrote that into the show has some insider knowledge, because that kind of stuff happens way too often. Way too often. Yeah. So no, that's a funny show.
Yeah, it's hilarious. So, are you from the mountains up there in Colorado? Where did you grow up?
Originally, actually, I'm from as far away as you can get from the mountains here in the United States. Little state known as Florida. I hail from the town of Orlando, home of the mouse, Mickey Mouse.
You know, we've been known to have some Florida men on this podcast before, so.
Oh yeah? Any notable ones that I might know?
Well, Joey Marshall, he was in the latest Mr. Beast challenge, the pilot one.
Okay.
Joey's a friend of the show, and a professor of economics out there was on the show before as well, talking about beer.
Oh, no kidding. I'm a Floridian at heart, but I love the mountains.
The reason you went into the army, though, was that uncles, grandparents, who served in Vietnam before you?
So nobody in my direct immediate family served in Vietnam. I have two uncles that were in the Air Force, and then my grandfather, he served in the Army in World War II. My aunt's ex-husband, who's no longer in the family, he was in Vietnam. And I recently had the opportunity to talk to him about his experiences. He was actually with the Marines when they first hit Vietnam in 1964. He was 60, might have been 65. I always get those 2 days mixed up. Yeah, so he was my relative of Vietnam, but I had a lot of family. My dad's close friend, who I affectionately remember as Mr. Ron. He passed away in 2000 from lung cancer, but he was in Vietnam. So I grew up going over to his house, and he had this kind of like man cave with the pool table, and it just smelled like Marlboro Reds cigarettes. And he had like his Vietnam helmet up on the wall, and it was like your classic typical Vietnam vet guy. He had the POW flag hanging high in his man cave. He had a record collection of all the bands from that era. So I kind of just grew up at a very young age being exposed to a Vietnam vet in Mr. Ron. And then I started martial arts later on as a young kid, and one of the senseis, he was a Vietnam vet. So I've just had, tangential interactions from, the earliest days of my life with Vietnam vets. But also, growing up in the early 90s, there was a lot of Vietnam War movies circulating on cable TV at the time. So there was Rambo, Apocalypse Now, Platoon, all the Deer Hunter, all the classics. So I just grew up, being exposed to it.
Yeah. Yeah, me probably the same. Like, I mean, obviously I'm Finnish originally, or grew up in Finland, no specific connection to Vietnam, but culturally it was always the most fascinating war. I think everyone goes through phases where World War II, like, it's just such a massive thing, and obviously I'm Jewish as well, so that part of history I had to read through, and I was really interested in that. But at some point, Vietnam just became my war, maybe it's the music, the movies, just that period in the 60s was so fascinating. Obviously, more color TV footage, actual, live footage from the war, that helps.
Oh yeah. Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Yeah, so I would add on that and I think, we've talked about this a little bit when we were texting, but my experience, and I think maybe a little bit to your experience, relates to Vietnam, is we participated in these military actions that come to bear very significant parallels to what happened in Vietnam. And the more I've dug into the history of Vietnam, and the more I look around at what's happening in our modern era, it's like it's either a parallel to that same strain of people and thoughts, or it's a direct outgrowth of that time frame. Everything that's going on right now is one of those two things. It's either a direct parallel or it's a direct outgrowth, pretty much across the board.
Very interesting way of phrasing it. Yeah, you can either trace the actual history to today and see that it's an extension of the same superpower competition or whatever. And then, yeah, especially the foot soldiers or the little guys experience in the jungle, in all the first-hand accounts I've read and stuff. There are like crazy parallels where you think like the way these guys thought, the way the big picture was often obscured. I mean, later on, the big picture was maybe obscured even on the top level with the generals and the and the politicians, but it was obscured from the get-go. The little guys didn't understand, like, right? Their parents had served in World War II, where the bad guys and the good guys, it was all very black and white, and now you are in more of a gray zone. And then you and I probably participated in some conflict zones where that gray area was there all the time. And as the little guy who doesn't see the big picture because you have no need to know or whatever, you have these questions in your head, and they're the same questions that they had in Vietnam.
Well, yeah, 100%. And that's a good point. I would say that not only did the little guy not know in terms of, strategic or geopolitical what the point was, the average Joe, the average GI Joe, right, in Vietnam was a young kid, 17 to, 23 probably. And a lot of them were later on, as the war progressed, become drafted. And they were there for ideological purposes because they believed in America and they believed in American ideals, as most soldiers for any country believes in whatever ideals their side is, espousing. But on top of all that, I would add that physically, the terrain of Vietnam is a dense jungle. So not only do you not know what's going on and what the purpose of your fight is in a strategic sense or even in a geopolitical sense, but you don't even know what's going on in the field of vision that you have. You're fighting an enemy that exists literally as shadows, and most of the time you don't even see them. That's what's crazy about jungle warfare.
That's why you're here, by the way. That's why you asked why I didn't have some kind of top academic to talk about the Vietnam War. This is why, because I've never heard anyone made that point before, that the sort of fog of war is a literal thing and also a conceptual thing, where literally you're in this dense place where you don't know where you're being shot at from or booby-trapped from, who the enemy is and where they are. And also in a more maybe philosophical sense, you wouldn't have quite understood the reason why you were there in the first place. So.
Yeah. And that's what I try to bring to the listeners of my show is kind of a first person, I'm not a first person eyewitness, and nobody that I'm studying who is written is really a direct first person eyewitness of these fights per se, but I'm trying to bring the perspective of the troop, whether they're the Viet Minh, the Viet Cong, or the Americans or the French, to the listener. But yeah, I mean, it's hard enough in a war, right? Like take any war, right? Take World War I. Like you see the enemy lines maybe like a couple hundred yards ahead. It's some barbed wire. You see a couple dots of enemies, but you're probably not going to see the enemy that shoots you unless you've made it that far into the enemy trench and now it's hand-to-hand combat. But you still saw them. You could still see them over there, and you still had clear demarcation lines of what was the forward line of the enemy versus what's your line. And that was largely the case in World War II, I'd say. But Vietnam is unique because they didn't have any of that. And it's unique compared to our time frame because today, well, we've got drones overhead with thermal vision capabilities that can spot an enemy in thick underbrush and, identify people to a high degree of confidence. You've got, top of the line surveillance equipment, whether it's handheld optics that soldiers have or, overhead support. Back then, they didn't have any of that. At best, they had a recon plane flying around doing circles over an area, just looking for an enemy. But even if you found a couple of enemies walking through the fields, you don't know how many they represent. Are they the whole unit, or are they a small little group and there's 10,000 more that you can't see?
Yeah. Any specific times in your service, like where did you end up going as a ranger? Any specific times that remind you, like kind of would be parallels to a Vietnam experience?
Terrain wise, no. Combat wise, not really. But what the generals and the politicians were trying to do at the time that I was in is very reminiscent of the Richard Nixon era of the Vietnam War, where it was quote unquote the Vietnamization.
So this is Afghanistan, yeah? I'm guessing.
Afghanistan, yep, yep. But for anybody who doesn't know, the Vietnamization of the war was the United States' effort to hand off the fighting duties to the Vietnamese and then draw down the U.S. presence. Step by step, you train them up, you give them more responsibility, you let them take the reins, you let them have more say so in planning and conducting of operations. We were doing the exact same thing in Afghanistan, with the exact same outcome, as it turns out. We took in Afghans, we trained them, we did our best to lead them in combat operations, and then conduct iterative processes where we explain to them what can be improved to make them more strategic and tactical thinkers so that they can prolong the fight against the Taliban in our absence. But as we saw with 2021, the Afghan pullout, I mean, it's hard to see, the people falling off the wheel wells of those C-17s taking off as very much different than those people that you see in the photographs of Saigon.
Yeah, Fall of Saigon 75, right? Yeah.
And it's just like, that's crazy. Like, how did nobody learn that lesson? How did nobody learn that you need to do an iterative phased withdrawal? You take actions over time. And so you didn't ask, but I'll go ahead and tell you that it's like I can't help but blame every single president who was involved in the global war on terror. Everybody from George W. Bush all the way to President Biden, because every single president and every single general had the opportunity to revise the withdrawal plan, to revise it and say, okay, what's the new plan? Like every year we're going to re-update the plan and we're going to have a new plan that fits the conditions, but nobody did that apparently at all, as it turns out. And it was just a total embarrassing clusterfuck.
Yeah. I do have to say, maybe to the credit of the South Vietnamese, I think they were much more into the project of Vietnamization and they were much better forces than what the Afghans ended up being. From what I've heard, you've been there. Tell me, the Afghans, were they all high all the fucking time, as that one movie put it? Is it War Machine with Brad Pitt? Yeah, that movie. These guys are high all the fucking time.
Yeah, that movie was pretty funny, although I would say it was a little more on the satirical side than the accurate. But it made valid points. Were they high all the time? Well, I'll tell you this. My first deployment, we were in Afghanistan, obviously. Second deployment in Afghanistan too, but the distinction is there because the first deployment, we had a small group of Afghans that were attached to us. We got real bad vibes from them. There were needles that they would utilize, for heroin that we would find in their trash. We were told explicitly, hey, don't trust these guys. They're being monitored. Don't trust them. Don't be friends with them. And also, if you ever get the code word, don't be afraid to shoot them. Right. And these were considered like some of the highest tier Afghan national forces that the United States was working with. Maybe not the highest tier, but they weren't like the police forces. They were the Afghan special operations equivalent, right? So that tells you something right there. Then my second deployment, it was actually totally opposite. Like we got really good vibes. There was a lot more of them. I made friends with one of them who's now here in the United States and is living in Texas I think he's a truck driver now, and he's doing just fine. He integrated and, he's on board with American and Western values. So I don't know, man. All I know is that if your country collapses to the Taliban almost immediately, after 20 years of being trained and supplied by the United States, I don't know how else to interpret that other than they weren't ideologically committed to what the United States was trying to project upon them in the first place.
And now we can ask the same. Well, the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the South Vietnamese, they collapsed pretty quickly too. But they were properly motivated elite forces, the ones who had, I mean, I guess in Afghanistan it was much more of a mixed bag. The South Vietnamese was, at least the tip of the spear was pretty good forces, I think.
Well, I don't know. See, that's a interesting and difficult question to answer because you're talking about such a large group of people in the Arvin, and they had problems. They had problems almost from the very beginning. But what I will say is that whether it's the South Vietnamese Arvin forces surrendering or the Afghan National Forces, it's easy to judge, right? It's easy to judge. Oh, they should have put up a better fight. But when the political climate of your country is oriented, at the enemy, and the enemy's coming, and the enemy's going to come, and you have nowhere to run, right? Well, now it's like, okay, your options really are you're going to execute an underground resistance operation. You can't do that widespread. Those kinds of operations are always conducted with limited numbers of people. So the average soldier has really no other option but to do his best to not get executed.
Yeah.
I try not to judge too harshly. It makes me sad that the South Vietnamese weren't able to, take back control, and it makes me sad that the Afghan National Forces that we trained and supported for all those years weren't able to put up a better fight against the Taliban. But
Yeah.
it's easy to judge when you're not in a survival situation like that.
Yeah, we'd have to say maybe something a little bit about the enemy, which you mentioned here. There some parallels as well, I guess. Not afraid of death, where radical Islamists or brainwashed communists who were probably pumped full of drugs and as well, both of those forces. At least that's what you're afraid of, that there's this brainwashed lunatic who's barely like, who somehow dehumanized himself by becoming an ideological zealot and probably high on Captagon or whatever the Assad regime was pumping around the Middle East, some kind of amphetamines. So I guess the enemy, in a sense, is similar too, right? It's they think in centuries, these ideologies, rather than thinking about next week or the next election like we do in democracies.
Yes, that's a very good point. Yeah, exactly like you said. In the United States, the regime is going to change every 4 years. Maybe you've got some entrenched bureaucrats in the State Department that are gonna, keep the trajectory in foreign policy matters the same. But in China, in Vietnam, in Russia, in the Middle East, you're absolutely right. They're not concerned about elections. They're concerned about executing what they believe to be essentially their destiny, no matter how long it takes, no matter how many people have to get sacrificed. And you know, I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this, but it seems to me, and based on what I've read and stuff, that the Asiatic cultures kind of have a resign themselves to fate mentality.
At least, I mean, you can look at just something, it's not very controversial to say that, because you look at the education system, for example, there's this like lecturing from above rather than encouragement of critical thinking. I believe both the Japanese and Chinese have worked a lot on that in recent decades and are trying to have come to the West and looked around how we do it and stuff. But they have like a mix now of both systems. But it's like when authority tells you to do something, it's a little bit more. They're taught from a young age to listen to authoritative figures, I guess, rather than challenge them. That's at least to some extent true.
It's definitely true. There's definitely an argument probably to be made in academic circles as to how true, but it's certainly true that that's certainly baked into their culture and has been for thousands of years. I don't know how much you know about the Cultural Revolution. You ever read into any of that?
Which one? Oh, in China? No, I'm not an expert. I'd say cliff notes at best.
Cliff Notes. I think that's most people. I certainly am not an expert, but I did just recently read a book. It's called
Hey, you're from Florida, so we have to say congratulations.
yes. 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 I think I like to consider myself a top tier Florida man since I've read more than one book in my life.
There were no pictures in this one.
And there were no pictures in this one. But no, this book I read is called Red Memory, and it's by a British lady named Tanya Brannigan, I think her name is. She's a Guardian reporter, I think. But anyway, she's of Chinese British heritage. So she lived in China for a while, and she went around and she interviewed a lot of people, not all of them, but a few people that were participants in the Cultural Revolution in China, which was an event that took place in the 60s and 70s and kind of precipitated Mao Zedong's fall from grace in China. So for listeners who don't know, and I'll give the condensed version here. We're talking about authority. It made me think about it. Condensed version. Okay, so China takes control. The communists take control of China, I should say, under Mao Zedong. That's an epic tale and a long story in itself. But bottom line is, they take over in 1949, and they get to rebuilding China under a centralized communist regime, essentially. This involves something called the Great Leap Forward, where they're basically going to force industrialization on a mass scale and tinker with the economy in ways that basically killed, I think people cite around 30 million people due to starvation, man-made starvation that was the result of this Great Leap Forward. Well, because of that, people were starting to get a little upset in China with the way the Communist Party was running things. So Mao Zedong institutes what's called now the Cultural Revolution. And what he basically did was encourage the children of China in the cities, right? In the urban population zones, at least, to be better acolytes than even their parents were. And so this ignited this crazy phenomenon where parents or these kids were going around denouncing their teachers for not being communist enough, beating them, spitting on them, parading them around, denunciating them, having struggle sessions. And this whole thing kind of spiraled and snowballed to where people who didn't like people were denunciating each other. People were getting executed for not being good enough party members. And all these people were people who had fought, a lot of them at least, were people who had fought for the communist cause against the Chinese nationalists in the Civil War and then against the Japanese. And now there's this internal battle about who's more or better communist, right? And it snowballed, and it was crazy. It was crazy. But these people had a loyalty to Mao Zedong that pales in comparison. The closest comparison you could point to religious icons like Jesus Christ or the Prophet Muhammad. Like, they literally worship this dude,
Kim Jong-un.
Kim Jong-un.
That's another Asiatic religious icon.
Yep, exactly. So I guess the bottom line is that this stuff is well documented. It's just not well known in the West for some reason. I don't really know why we don't know more about it, because it's crazier in a lot of ways. In my opinion, it's crazier in a lot of ways than what the Nazis did. The Nazis did horrible things, and that shit was crazy, for sure.
Growing up in Finland, people barely talked about Stalin's purges and stuff, and that was right next door in Russia. Like, China's still pretty far away, but
yeah, I was going to ask you about the Finnish perspective. I assume it's not super favorable, but you guys knew more about it than the rest of the world at the time.
Finland and Vietnam is an interesting question, because I never really looked into it, because that wasn't... Now that you're asking me, now I'm actually interested, and I'll look into it. But if I had to guess, because Finland was in that period very much straddling between East and West, right? They had what you'd call a special relationship with the Soviet Union. So there was a lot of subversion, a lot of what you'd call backyard communists and backyard sympathizers of the Union. And then they also wanted to be part of the Western world. So a lot of, free market still, and and all of that. So a strange place. So I would have said during the Vietnam War, there must have been a pretty 50-50 split, that the left would have in Finland would have been anti-US, pro-Soviet, and the right would have been very pro-US. Still today, it's the same thing, right? Yeah.
Finland is part of NATO or not?
Now it is, yeah, since last year.
And it shares a border, shares a northern border with Russia. Is that correct?
Eastern border, 1,300 kilometers. Not a joke of a border.
No, that's a big border.
Well, you would understand this in military terms. Finland is the theater operations here coming up in this war that we're already in to some extent. Finland will be very much the theater, right? That's where East and West kind of collide. I suspect that the Baltic countries, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, I think they might be a pawn that we sacrifice as the Western alliance. They might be too tough to defend. I don't know. I'm not a general, but just looking at a map. And then I think Finland is where the war might be fought, if there is and when there is a physical confrontation.
I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised at all. That's another interesting topic because there's parallels to the whole Russia-Ukraine stuff that is a direct outgrowth of the Cold War.
Of course. And here, I mean, we are jumping everywhere, but that's good because I had a kind of a structure in case we don't get along and stuff, but a low risk. We're getting along great. We can now jump. We did a little bit about how the war ended and stuff, but just this, the culture wars in America, the opposition to the war, everything. I grew up as a kind of alt kid maybe or whatever. I sympathized with hippies and all of that and saw a lot of good points, and that's where all the cool culture came from. The best music and all that came from the opposition to this war. But now that what you just said is that the same Cold War is still continuing and the same empires are still here. It's West versus East. You know, Russia, China, US, and their blocs or allies.
Mm-hmm.
So now, to all those, if they're still alive, maybe a few are listening, who opposed this war, the hippies and stuff back then, I'd like to ask, what do you think now? Because was it actually such a bad idea to go and physically confront Russian and Chinese imperialism in Vietnam? Because it was going to come to a head somewhere. The Cold War was going to turn hot somewhere, then why not there? I mean, there were plenty of reasons why not there. The jungle, first of all, and things like that. But I'm saying, was it so bad now in retrospect that that war was fought? It wasn't meaningless, right? Because then you're saying that Ukraine is fighting meaninglessly as well.
No, I don't think you can say it's meaningless. My opinion based on everything I've read and learned is that it wasn't pretty and it didn't work out the way we had hoped, but it wasn't a waste either, because if you look at China and you look at Vietnam, they're not the same countries that they were. They've been forced to embrace global economic trade. And by doing so, it kind of tethers them into the rest of the world, which makes hot wars costlier. I don't know if that was intentional. I think it probably was. I know that there were specific efforts by the Nixon administration to, bring China back into the fold because we were afraid of what would happen if we didn't. And now they are, to an extent, and to a large extent even, in the fold, and we're all kind of tethered together along economic lines. Natural resources. Europe was and probably still is to some extent buying natural gas and oil from Russia.
Yeah.
While funding the Ukrainians to fight Russia. I mean, and the reason why is because everybody was so entwined in this global economy of ours now. I'm not sure that's a bad thing. I really don't. I've heard cases that it's not great. But as far as I can tell, when people are economically aligned and have shared interests, no matter how small those interests may seem, when we're talking about dollars and big dollars for countries that are relatively poor, it's a good way to keep people from going rogue and aligning themselves with bad actors,
Yeah. All right. Let's pivot to the role of the media. I think that's an interesting one. The opposition to this war that we discussed there a little bit, and how it polarized American society. This was the first color TV war in history, right? Where actual footage of dying and maimed people was pumped into people's living rooms.
Yes.
Do you think that was the only reason? Like, was that why the war was lost, more or less?
The war was lost because generals bungled it and politicians bungled it. That's why the war was lost. But public support, which is absolutely necessary in the United States for wars, because the public votes, and when the public wants a war to end, they vote out the Congress people who support wars, and they vote in Congress people who don't support wars. And then you lose political support in Congress for wars, and funding stops, and that's how wars end in the United States. So the war was lost because politicians and generals failed to do things in the beginning, which created a protracted and long quagmire. And then the public support was starting to be like, well, this war is dragging on. But not only is it dragging on, but I'm seeing horrifying images, which for the first time in really human history had not been exposed to the public. Like, the public was like, now it's 2025. I can go on X and I see people getting their heads blown off in war footage for, hours on end, pretty desensitized. But you got to think, this is back in the 60s, right? People who were teenagers and in their early 20s were born in the mid to late 40s. They grew up with radios. Then you got the TV, and it was black and white, and it had 3 stations, and it only came on in the evening. And it was like, some old guy sitting there telling you specifically curated news events. And then Vietnam happens, and now you've got color TV, like you were saying, showing kids burned from napalm, villages, smoke billows coming from villages, bodies everywhere. Actually, brief segue along the same topic, but the U.S. favorite to run South Vietnam in the 50s was a guy named, I'm going to butcher his name, No Dien Diem.
Was this one of them was called Big Dom and one of was Little Dom or something like that? Are these those?
You're on the right track. I forget the name exactly, but the guy who you're referring to as Big whoever, he was the general that led the coup against this guy. But so the U.S. really liked Diem. We put him in. He was our puppet. He was the United States puppet. He ends up being, as the United States has a tendency to do, kind of an authoritarian dictator, but he's our authoritarian dictator. He's heavily anti-Buddhist. He was a staunch Catholic. He staffed his administration with family members, and he cracked down on the Vietnamese Buddhists. So everybody remembers that famous photo, which is on the Rage Against the Machine album, where the Buddhist monk, lights himself on fire. That event was in response as a protest against that gentleman, Diem's presidency, because of his crackdown against the Buddhists. And the Vietnamese in the South were like, whoa, you don't represent us. We're the Vietnamese. You're bringing in all this Catholic stuff, you're cracking down on the people's religion of Buddhism. So the sentiment starts to fade, and the United States says, well, hey, we need to do something about this. So JFK, President Kennedy, says, I'm open to a regime change, gives the head nod, doesn't say so explicitly to our knowledge, but basically gives the head nod that the generals that hate this guy have to go ahead and U.S. support to execute a coup and depose Diem. And they do. They capture him. He surrenders. They capture him, and then they murder him. They stab him while he's in custody and shoot him and his brother. And then they parade the bodies, and the pictures of the bodies circulate in the U.S. media. And this is like the first instance where a political assassination like this is broadcast to the public. And from that moment on is when we really start to see these images and the true reality of war circulating in the households of Americans. So I bring that up because that's in my understanding of the timeline of events here. That's like the first time that the American public was like, "Oh, what's going on here?" And this was the very beginning. Like the United States hadn't really even been involved very intensively in fighting there, and it only gets worse through the 60s and the 70s.
Completely forgotten part of the war actually is that there's the sort of Northern Ireland element to it as well. The Catholics and Buddhists, there was a bit of a religious strife there as well. That's not something that even I remember very often. The self-immolation I do remember, and I do remember that that wasn't against American troops or anything like that. It's been sort of conflated in people's minds that that was a local protest to American invasion or something, but the Americans weren't really there in any big numbers yet. Later on, someone else lit themselves on fire during the Arab Spring. Was it in Tunisia, where the Arab Spring revolution started from that? Yeah. Interesting move, that, lighting yourself on fire.
You can't say you don't got balls, I guess. I wouldn't recommend it. A statement it makes, however. And then there was that airman, the United States airman in Gaza, who lit himself on fire. Do you remember that?
No.
No. That happened sometime after the October 7th massacre and the subsequent Israeli response. The United States had a presence there, and an airman, United States Air Force member, lit himself on fire in protest. I'm glad that didn't get much circulation in the in the other parts of the world.
In protest of what?
In protest of Israeli operations in Gaza.
Right. Like early on in the war.
Early on, yeah, early on.
Tough position to defend, though. Like
That's
early
what I'm
on in the
saying.
war, it's a tough position to defend.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, but yeah, interesting. When the Americans do arrive, we have like this first stage is not like full on war yet. They're calling it a police action, right? But like Marines are dying in the jungle, but they're not even getting credit of being like war veterans yet. This is a strange stage of the war, right?
I will admit I'm not super clear on that exact timeline, but I can tell you that the United States had troops in Vietnam as early as 1955. They were a very small number, and they were there to train guerrilla forces. And then Kennedy sends more Green Berets, what is known as the American Special Forces, U.S. Green Berets, and they're there, and they start taking more direct hand and counterinsurgency operations against the Viet Cong. That's when they were special advisors, or it was more of a police action, and they were dying, and they're not being, it's a quiet thing. You're not trying to amplify what's going on there at this time. And then Kennedy gets assassinated, and then Lyndon Johnson comes on board. Lyndon Johnson is the one who amplifies and takes it to the next level. He's the one who said, we need to draw up big time, and draw up they do. They went from like about 150,000 soldiers to 400,000 over the course of a few years. This all started with something called Operation Rolling Thunder, which kicked off the war. That's when we dropped more munitions than the entirety of World War II on Laos and northern Vietnam to try to blow up the Ho Chi Minh Trail and cut off the supply of weapons and supplies that were feeding the Viet Cong in the south. That was the beginning. That was the beginning of what do we do about the insurgency in the south? Well, the answer is not. You're not going to do a whole lot. You're not going to do much good. You're only going to turn the people of Vietnam against you, because now their villages are getting bombed by B-52s dropping, carpet bomb loads on these people.
Get resettlement schemes where they moved entire villages by helicopter to another spot so that they could carpet bomb wherever their old village stood. And policies like that in retrospect probably weren't gonna win a lot of hearts and minds.
Right. We were kind of toying around with the hearts and minds concept back then. Fast forward to Afghanistan. It's 2021, 2012 through 2017 when I was there. And we're still trying this hearts and minds idea, which by now we should realize doesn't work.
The general rule, I guess, people don't want to give their hearts and minds to a foreign force. I think it's something natural in humans.
I think you're right.
They want to make their own mistakes, whether the foreign authority might be completely correct in what needs to happen now for your own good. Doesn't matter whether they're right or wrong. They want to make their own mistakes.
And that's a good point, because Ho Chi Minh, that was his appeal to the Vietnamese people. I'm of the people. I'm like you. I'm poor, even though he was way more sophisticated and educated than any of them were, but the peasants. But he appealed to them. He appealed to their Vietnamese nature and the desire to have nationalist independence from under the French. And this kind of goes all the way back to the post-World War II saga of, well, after World War II, a lot of these imperial powers that had colonies, like France, well, they're now having to realign. They don't have that power anymore. They don't have the control. There was a civil war in Greece that was all about, realigning what the people wanted from their government. And that was the beginning of the fear of the communist spread under Truman. And then in Vietnam, same thing. The people wanted to be free from France. France did not do a lot to keep the goodwill of the people on their side while they held Vietnam and, well, Indochina writ large as a colony. It's crazy because in today's modern time, you hear a lot about settler colonialism, especially in places like Israel, right? And that's kind of like that's kind of how this weird coalition of Western leftism has kind of glossed on to supporting some barbaric group like Hamas. Well, they're conflating the issue, I think, but they're pointing to this notion of colonialism. Well, this notion of colonialism hails all the way back, to Lenin in the early 1900s. So it's nothing new. There's nothing new here. The argument's always been the same.
Yeah, and they're funded. Back in the day, the KGB had a slush fund they built in Europe to fund movements at universities and in the arts and everything, wherever leftists hung out, where they could quickly find people who would sympathize with one part of their cause, which is, I don't know, workers' struggle or standing up to the little guy. Admirable causes of communism. No one can argue with those. But then they tacked on all of these other nonsense. Oh, also, by the way, if you're on the left, in the Middle East, that means you're a full-on Islamist. If you're on the left, that means in Vietnam, you're against anything the West is doing there and you're pro whatever we're doing. Like, they started tacking on this stuff. And nowadays it's funded by, cryptocurrency from Iran and Qatar and all that stuff. Like, it's not new.
No, it's definitely not new. It's definitely not new. It's just, it was interesting to me when I learned, like, oh, these ideological strains that are being repurposed and repackaged for the public in 2025 are really the old strains that have always been around. They're not new ideas.
And yeah, and the whole overarching theme here between us has been how the same themes from Vietnam are still around now in the conflicts we see today. Like, whether it's philosophical, political, or the experience of the grunt on the ground, it's all still there, which is part of the reason why this thing fascinates so many people, why those movies were such big hits, and why people still read the first-hand accounts of helicopter pilots and stuff. By the way, you as a ranger, if you had been born a few decades earlier, would it have been LRPs, long-range reconnaissance patrols in the jungle? Is that what rangers did back then in Vietnam?
Yes, that is where we trace our military lineage to. The LRPs units of Vietnam were some of the very first. Actually, the first Rangers were really in World War II. It was different though. The structured training of the Rangers today really traces its lineage back to Korea, the Korea time frame. That's when they created a Ranger school, and then the long range reconnaissance patrols of Vietnam, which that's some crazy stuff right there.
I mean, my recommendation is for anyone, even if the listener on average isn't maybe as tuned into military technicalities as you might be, or even myself, I'd say some of the stuff is just insane. Like they were in the middle of nowhere in countries that the war wasn't even officially in, like Laos and Cambodia, where getting help when you're wounded was basically they had these things that dropped down from helicopters, maybe if they got there on time and didn't get shot down, through the canopy of the jungle. And it was like this basket you sat in, and then it tore you out of the jungle. And people would like lose extra limbs because they'd get stuck in the canopy and stuff. And like it was a horrific way. Like, being
Yes.
in those long range patrols was no bueno.
Jungle penetrator is what they call it.
Yeah. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me tell you a quick story since we're talking about LERP stuff. I know a LERPs guy, fellow Florida man, actually. His name's Randy.
He's from Florida. What else would he be called?
Randy.
Randy and Bob. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, no, so it's actually a crazy story. I met Randy just in passing at the airport in Orlando. I was still active duty. I saw he had a Ranger hat. I said, "Hey, Ranger buddy, I'm Steven, blah, blah, blah. When did you serve?" Quick conversation, 30 seconds, peace. Never thought I'd see him again. But then there's a breakfast in Orlando where these old Rangers from across the generations get together and hang out. And I go, and I'm like, "Oh, dang, I know this guy." Come to find out, he was in LERP's unit. And back then, the structure, I won't bore the listeners with the details on the structure, but it wasn't like one big unit of Rangers. It was a collection of LERPs units attached to different infantry battalions, but they kind of shared a common mission and a common culture, which is, we're LERPs, we're badasses, we're the best of the best, we're going behind enemy lines, doing like long reconnaissance patrols. Think like 10 days behind enemy lines to conduct recon, to set up ambushes, that kind of stuff. Well, he was telling a story about how, one of their tactics was to have footprints the opposite direction on the bottom of their boots, so that when they walk through the jungle, it looks like barefoot, or, Viet Minh-sized feet walking the other direction than the direction they were going in, that kind of stuff. But also he told a story about how one time there was an experimental technique that they were going to try out, where they put this metal dish, it was airlifted with them in it, into a tree, and then they waited in this metal dish in the tree until a Viet Minh patrol or Viet Cong patrol came walking through, and then they ambushed them from the trees, and then a helicopter comes back and then takes them off, picks it back up and then flies it away. And I was like, what the heck? I can see why that wasn't used very often, because suppose you don't succeed in getting everybody in your ambush, right? And a couple of them run off. Well, like, what are you going to do when they come back in force and you're stuck in the tree? Hey, you're sitting ducks in a tree.
There are some drawbacks to this plan. Also, you're trusting the canopy to hold that weight as well.
Yeah, exactly. You're trusting the canopy to hold the weight. There's a lot of things that could go wrong in this technique, but I think in this instance it did work out for them. And then another thing he told me is more of a funny story, was he was back at the fire base, and I guess they had some downtime, and somebody sent one of his friends like some acid, like LSD. But this stuff that they had back then, that the acid back then, a lot of it was like lab made by like chemists. There weren't a lot of like homegrown LSD labs. LSD, people were able to get it. It wasn't as, and actually the CIA was like making it available, but that's a topic for a different discussion.
Wait. If we're gonna mention that, then we have to, like, just as a public service announcement, we have to say to everyone, like, just check this out. The LSD, acid, the CIA, they potentially also created the Unabomber by accident from that program.
And possibly Charles Manson. Yep.
Charles Manson, yeah, possibly also somehow. Yeah, this is an interesting. It's not even a conspiracy theory. It's more of a what the fuck.
It's legit now. At this point, it's like been pretty well documented and proven. Like the evidence is there. Like it happened. Like the LSD was a psyop. The CIA knew that they could undercut, discredit the hippie movement in the United States by making them look like a bunch of drugged out fucking hippie losers that were high all the time on acid. And back then there was no like dosage guides like, oh, you take 1 tab. No, it was like a liquid form that they put in punch bowls, so people were getting fried, permanently fried for life by this acid. But yes, the listeners, it's legit. There's lots of YouTube videos out there. I It's crazy.
Well, okay, I don't know where we were, but let's go there. Now you as a ranger, let's say in this thought experiment, you're finished your tour. You've been in these LERP patrols and been fucked up by jungle far away from your own lines. Now it's time to go home. Your government has, other than LSD on your civilian population, they've also waged biological warfare on you because they've dropped Agent Orange and all these Agent Purple and all this other shite on you. Your knees are probably fucked. You have leeches all over you. Whatever. Weird venereal diseases some of us may have contracted back then. You know, a lot of these guys were virgins, by the way. Remember, as you mentioned, the average age of a World War II combat casualty was way higher than in Vietnam. Is like 19 or 20 or something.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, a lot of them went there virgins, and then prostitutes come into the picture. So you're going home now. The society pretty much is split between adoring you and hating you. Is there any parallel there with you coming home from Afghanistan?
No, no. I'll get to that in a second, but the short answer is no. But let me get back to your point real quick. Yes, you're absolutely right. My sensei Seeley, who I was talking about earlier from Vietnam, he dealt with lifelong Agent Orange related cancer. He had to fight with the Veterans Administration, VA, to get help. It took him a long time to get acknowledgement for his cancers that he kept dealing with. He had like skin cancer, leukemia, and he dealt with this like multiple rounds for decades, like cancers that keep coming back. He's got to go back through cancer treatment. If they catch in time, they can remove it. But leukemia, you can't. That one's kind of bad. But yeah. So yeah, exactly. You're exactly right. They are they get these injuries, psychological injuries, from what they're seeing in war. Okay. They're getting biological related injuries from the compounds they're exposed to in the defoliage campaign to, get rid of the jungle by killing it with pesticides and stuff and herbicides. And then they're coming back and the military didn't really give a fuck about their problems. And the American public either didn't want to hear about it because it was so gruesome and the stuff was all over the news and it was negative, or they outright hated you because they saw you as being a tool of American imperialism sent to kill the yellow man who's just trying to fight for the freedom of their country. And you've got shit like Jane Fonda sitting on a North Vietnamese artillery piece wearing a helmet doing a photo op with the enemy, and somehow that lady isn't like strung up by her freaking thumbs and left to rot. Like, I don't get it, but that was what the troops were dealing with.
Yeah. Now we have the same, by the way. Now we have celebrities posing with basically jihadists and terrorists and stuff while the rest of us are trying to fight a war,
Right. I mean, and I think it's a good case to point to Israel, the IDF, and the bad press that Israel gets in Gaza. But I mean, you're fighting a very similar kind of enemy. They're guerrilla war. It's guerrilla warfare in an urban setting where they utilize the local population as human shields, and then they capitalize on the propaganda win when there's collateral damage to delegitimize the Israeli, side of that war. Same thing with what happened in the United States. And then the population of the United States, the hippie class, and the intellectual class of Berkeley and these other Ivy League institutes are just eating it up because it looks bad and it makes them feel bad. And, then they treat the troops like total degenerate. And a lot of them were drafted. A lot of them didn't even choose to go there. They got forced to go there for a whole year. So it's just backwards all around. Now, to a roundabout way to get back to your question about my experience is 100% the opposite, 180 degrees the opposite. The VA and the public in the global war on terror era remembers what happened in Vietnam and has gone out of their way to make things way better for veterans and to show their love and gratitude and appreciation, which is a good thing. But the negative part of that good benevolence is that it's created an entire class of veterans that are just entitled, and I call it the bro vet class. I do not associate myself with them, but you see them all over social media. They're the Navy SEALs. They're all over podcasts, writing books, acting talking about how cool they are. Those guys, it's a disgrace. It's like, how about you shut up? How about you keep your opinions to yourself? You served your country. That's all that we appreciate that, and the country owes you a debt of gratitude. But this elevation of the veteran to this kind of celebrity I think has gotten out of hand personally. But
The truth is somewhere in between. When people return from somewhere where they've done something that they at least believed themselves. First of all, they may have been forced in the countries that have drafts still today. Secondly, they may have very conflicting opinions. They may know a lot more about it than you. And they might agree with you on some things, not agree on others. I think the truth is, even if you disagree with the war, it's got nothing to do with the fighters. But then also, I think most veterans feel very weirded out if they're asked to go do the first pitch at a baseball game, or this kind of attention doesn't come naturally for people who choose to serve, at least who choose to serve in elite combat units. It's a different type of person. I'm with you. I think it's a little bit icky if you want, I don't know, that adoration. It's hypocritical of me to say I have a podcast and I've appeared on other podcasts talking about wars and stuff, but still, you know what I mean, that.
yeah, there's a big difference. Being a veteran and talking about your experience and having your opinions is one thing, but making a brand, I think that's my beef. The branding of the cool guy operator. We all know what this guy looks like. He's a jacked athletic guy. He's tatted up. He's got a beard. He's got some cool brand that he's trying to sell, whether it's coffee or supplements or a podcast. That's my problem, is we shouldn't be branding our warriors for commercial exposure, because I don't know. It's my own personal peeve. I think there's a quiet professionalism that should be required, but
Yeah. And again, we're talking about this in public, so we're hypocrites, but I get your point. I agree with you. I think there's a way to do it that's kind of sort of balanced. There's a difference if you have an intellectual interest in someone's experience and they talk about it, that's great. But as you said, wearing that SEALs t-shirt and then hawking protein bars, that is weird.
yeah. It's like, let's have some perspective and remember all the veterans of all the other wars who endured crazy and circumstances, the types of things that I talk about in my show, but have no parallel hardly at all in the modern era. And you never hear them talking about it.
Yeah. That's a good point. I mean, it's an interesting thought. I mean, to bring it back to Vietnam, I mean, that war consumed American society to a much greater extent than these, I don't remember who it was who called them luxury wars. The Western world in recent decades has had these luxury wars where we sent limited professional forces to fight quick wars in and out. In America's case, not so quick, but in most places, actually, America went in and out, other less famous wars, Somalia, Libya, things like that. But Vietnam was like a full-on war with a draft, and like the entire power of the American military was involved. So veterans' experiences probably came in all shapes and sizes, right? I mean, the infrastructure and the science wasn't there yet, I don't think, about Agent Orange and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, the science isn't there if you don't test it, right? Like, if you don't test it on if you don't test it on, human biological samples, or do animal testing on it beforehand of any kind, yeah, then you can be like, yeah, we didn't know. We didn't know this carcinogenic chemical was going to cause cancer. How could we have known? Well, yeah, you never tested it,
Yeah.
right? Like, well, yeah, it's not for human use, of course. Why would we test it on humans? It's not for human. Well, yeah, right. They play those kinds of games. Like, that's pretty standard, I think, in the halls of the military industrial complex.
Yeah, right. I mean, Stephen, this has been amazing, huge topic, and we were all over the place, but I knew it would be that because there's no way to like cover this thing. I mean, can we get a promise from you to come back? Maybe more about Vietnam and also about your own experiences. Maybe we can dig in, or we can dig into something else that you're interested in because you're a interesting guy.
No, hey, I would love that. I would be honored. I would come back in a heartbeat.
If you need to hawk any like promote any protein product you're involved with, let's do that. For the end, you don't have to leave us with a lofty public service announcement. I'll put the links to your excellent podcast in the description, Green Hell, and you're about to move into the American War there. So
We're getting close. We still got to talk about the Battle of Dien Bien Phu.
yes, the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu.
And that's a crazy tale. It's a 55-day battle.
That the CIA watched from the air, as far as I understand.
The CIA was there. The French pleaded for the United States to support it, but we were paying for it. So we were like, well, we're paying for it. You guys can fight it.
Instead of a lofty announcement, can you give us, from your perspective as a real world super soldier, superhero, and as a Vietnam expert, one movie, one book that are fantastic and everyone should read and watch,
Absolutely.
and then one that's really overrated and a piece of shit?
Okay, sure. One movie everybody should watch, Vietnam movie, Platoon, directed by Oliver Stone, has Charlie Sheen, Willem Dafoe, Lawrence Fishburne, like a ton of people. I think Johnny Depp's in
Oliver
it.
Stone himself went to Vietnam, was a Marine.
Oliver Stone was a E4 infantryman, went to Vietnam. It's as accurate of an infantryman's perspective as you're ever going to get, I think, in terms of Hollywood-made war movies. So for sure, that one, if you're new to Vietnam. And then a book, Street Without Joy by Bernard B. Fall, is the tale of the French Indochina War. He was a reporter from the United States, but had French heritage. He was there in Vietnam for pretty much the whole thing, so much so that he died from a bouncing Betty while on patrol with the Marines when the United States got there. So, that's as legit as a reporter as you're ever going to find on that war. And he really lays it out in fascinating detail. And then an overrated Vietnam War movie. Forrest Gump. No, I'm just kidding. I can't say that. I can't say that.
Forrest Gump's the greatest movie ever made.
I love Forrest Gump. I love Forrest Gump.
That's one of the pivotal Vietnam scenes, is when the choppers come in.
It is.
Fortunate Son by CCR is playing. That's an awesome Vietnam movie. Come on.
It is. I'm really hard pressed to think of one that's overrated. Oh, you know what? Here's one that I think's overrated. I think what's that? Full Metal Jacket. I think Full Metal Jacket's a little overrated.
Okay. The Vietnam part of it, maybe.
The Vietnam part of it, the basic training part is where that movie's at. But
because that actor was an actual drill sergeant in the Marines. Did you know that?
Yes, I did know that.
So I think you can't say that he wasn't good in his role, because he was just being himself.
I really kind of don't want to say that one is either, but I've heard that one cited so many times by Marines, and there's a healthy Marine army rivalry. So I'm gonna go with that one.
Okay, fair enough. It's easier with World War II movies because there are some shitty ones there. Vietnam movies
Oh,
tend to be great. Yeah.
there's less of them.
Stephen, what a pleasure to meet you, and we have to do another one in the future, and I'll keep listening to your podcast, and so will the entire Talking Ass community, because their dear leader says so.
Hey, Danny, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. It's been awesome. I hope you come back.
Yeah, have a great day, buddy.
All right, man. Take care.